When I was a little girl, I never dreamt about my wedding. I was a tomboy. All I ever wanted for Christmas and for my birthdays was punch bowls, guns, tanks. So weddings just weren't on my agenda at all. In fact, I probably, as I got older and got into my teens and became a punk rocker and then got into my 20s, was quite phobic about the thought of marriage and quite phobic about the thought of having a permanent partner and having a family. So when I did eventually get married, I shocked everybody I knew. I grew up in Birmingham, which was quite a difficult place for a girl to grow up 35 years ago. Women were forced into relationships, and I felt forced into being sexually active, and an awful lot of the girls that I knew were, their ideal was to have a child out of wedlock and get the security of a nice apartment and never get married and never get a job. And I hate to generalise about it, but that is the environment I grew up in. Because I grew up in that environment, I was ferociously against relationships. So I got involved in punk and in music around the age of 14. I knew that I was always going to be very different, started making my own clothes, starting to look very punky. I was very pre-punk. I was influenced by a film called The Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was pre-punk. So I was walking around Birmingham with peacock-coloured hair about 2 years before punk rock ever appeared. My husband and I should have met at least 5 to 6 years before we actually did, because we had the same management company. And the very first time I met him was 1983, where we shared a taxi to an awards ceremony together. And he sat on the front seat and I was on the back seat with my manager, our manager. And he was very quiet and he had these little round glasses, and I just took the mickey out of him from the King's Road to the Grosvenor Hotel, which was about a half-an-hour trip. And I can remember our manager just being flabbergasted that I had the guts to just provoke this man for half an hour, and I'd only just met him. I didn't know that he is in the top 10 of the world's most famous guitar players. He's a man called Robert Fripp, and at the 1983 he was just like God in the music world. He'd worked with David Bowie, he'd produced Peter Gabriel, he'd been on Blondie's albums, so he was a megastar. The picture behind me is of me and Princess Michael of Kent laughing at someone joking, and that someone is Robert Fripp, my husband. This is the first moment I really got to talk to him, because Princess Michael wanted a photograph taken with him and me. That picture appeared in a very famous newspaper the next day with Robert cut out of it, because Robert was never really a celebrity, but I was, and that was 1983, 3 years before I married Robert. So we didn't meet again until 2 years later, when we met at exactly the same awards ceremony, and he said to me, would I visit him at his home in Dorset and make an album with him, a charity album for a children's school in America? And I said yes. But what I didn't know, and this is very much how my husband works, when we met again in 1985, which would have been around June, July, he'd already said to his friends in America, where he lived in New York, he says, I'm wiping the diary clean for the next 3 weeks because I'm going to meet my wife. So he'd already had a kind of intuition about this. And then the following week, after we met and had this discussion, I went down to work with him on this album for a week, and he said, will you marry me? And I said, oh, it's a bit quick, isn't it? And he said, no, I know you're my wife. I've been planning this for the last month. And I kind of went, okay, well, let's get to know each other. So I actually moved to Washington for 3 months to the school where we were raising the money for, where he taught, because he also teaches guitar. And I went there and taught drama for 3 months, and that was our courtship. I still have my wedding bouquet, which is hard to believe. This dear thing is 22 years old, and we keep it in our front room. It was yellow originally. I adore yellow flowers. So we had yellow roses, yellow carnations, and then lily of the valley. And this is probably the most expensive thing about the wedding, was the lily of the valley on May the 16th were already out of season. So we had to have them brought in from Holland, and it wasn't cheap. But I did a little drawing of what I wanted, and a friend went along to a florist and got it organised. And miraculously, we have managed to keep it. I organised the wedding. My husband didn't want anything to do with any of those traditions other than the church ceremony. So he participated in the rehearsal. We married in a church in Witchhampton, Dorset, where his father was buried, and I think his grandparents were buried. And we did the rehearsal, but that was about as far as it went. I bought the wedding rings, I bought the wedding dress, I cooked all the food for the wedding party. He didn't want children at the wedding, he didn't want any of my friends at the wedding, but I insisted on close family. Basically, I realised that it was nerves. He can't bear big events. I have never had a party since I've been married because he can't bear those kind of events. Which is unusual but bearable. So he didn't want music at the wedding. It was a silent wedding, and the extraordinary thing was, it was on May the 16th, 1986. It had rained for a month, and the moment we arrived at the church, the sun came out and streamed through the windows exactly where we stood at the altar. I had the veil made. My sister-in-law had to organise it, so no one knew I was having a wedding veil made. So that went over the front. It's very brittle and delicate now. You've got to remember it's 22 years old. And this big flower went at the back. Now these are back in again today. Back then, this was 1986, big things were in. But seriously, that went out in the 90s big time. But I suppose you would see that in Sex in the City today. We managed to have the reception with very close family, and then the press ascended. And the next day, that evening and the next day, we were hounded. We were chased everywhere by journalists in cars. And eventually we drove off to a Franciscan retreat in Sancreed in Cornwall, who hid us. And we hid there for a week, and they blessed our wedding. This is the garter I wore for something blue, and I wore it on my left leg, I think. I could be wrong, but there's only two legs to choose from. It was a gift from my husband's best friend. They had it made by a local lace maker in Dorchester, and my husband now keeps this on his desk in his office. Because Robert and I were getting married secretly, I couldn't order a wedding gown, and because I was paying for everything, and basically my husband was not interested in a huge expensive public wedding. I had to really ponder of how I was going to be a bride. I thought, okay, I'll just go and buy a ball gown, and it was really hard for me to shop at this time because I was incredibly well known. I couldn't go anywhere on my own. So I knew of a kind of debutante ball shop in a town called Wimborne in Dorset, and I went there pretending I was going to a ball, and I bought the only ball gown that would fit me, that was a little pink organza bow peep dress. I found my dress. It's pink. I didn't want a traditional white wedding dress, which was lucky. This is actually a little ball gown, very bo peep, off the shoulder, puffball sleeves that just rested on the upper arm, little kind of gatherings at the bottom. So it was very feminine, very pretty indeed. I think marriage is cyclical. I think everything in life is cyclical. You go through cycles, and if you can recognise those cycles, you can recognise when a cycle is dipping and you're in a bad time, and also when a cycle is lifting and you're in a good time. And I think you only grow to recognise these things if you have longevity in a relationship. So 7 years ago, we found the home we're in now, which is just the most perfect, beautiful home in the world, in the Midlands. And we decided that, we wanted to spend more time together and travel a little bit less, and, just enjoy ourselves. We've worked really hard, not only as a couple, but as individuals as well. And you've got to bear in mind, we don't have children either, so, you know, we're not fixed, and we don't, you know, one of us isn't financially dependent on the other. But we go off, we have little honeymoons 3 or 4 times a year, and just lock the world out, and we're just romantic. And the one thing that both of us are, we are both very romantic. I love buying him gifts, and I love telling him to pack a bag, and you know, you're going to be in a warm climate, you'll be in a cold climate, oh, don't worry, you're not going to leave the bedroom for a week. You know, I like surprising him and taking him on nice adventures.
Next time on Celebrity Brides Unveiled, Olympic winner Sally Gunnell talks about how her husband went the extra mile to win her heart.
John always says he probably paid for the Dartford Tunnel because he so many times going up and down and over that tunnel, and he used to get up at sort of stay the weekend and get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and get back to Brighton to go to work and all these sorts of things.
Plus, the lovely Lucy Ruzetsky reveals how it was a case of love all with her tennis star husband, Greg.
I think very early on, Greg and I knew that it was serious, which is bizarre when you think I was only 15.